Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we will continue our reading of Mrs. Pringle of Fairacre by Miss Reed. Miss Reed is listening to the history of how Mrs. Pringle became Mrs. Pringle by marrying Fred Pringle, the undergardener, at the place where she was in service. It was a few days later that Bob Willett continued this enthralling episode in Fairacre's history. "You could have knocked us down with a feather when we heard poor old Fred was engaged to Maud. Not that he had a chance, of course, but Maud was so high and mighty, and the Pringles had a bad name." "Why?" "They was all a bit harum-scarum, and Josh Pringle, Fred's brother, was a proper bad 'un, poachin', pinchin', fightin', always in trouble and turnin' up in Caxley Court. No end of kids, and half of 'em not his wife's, if you follow me." I said I did. "The Bakers was upset about it, but couldn't do much. After all, Maud was of age, over age, come to that, and she and Fred got married in Caxley, where her parents lived, so us Fairacre folk didn't see or hear much of the weddin'. All this was before the war, of course." "I take it they came to live in Fairacre?" "Oh, yes, in one of Miss Parr's cottages, near where they are now. Fred did the garden, and Maud helped in the house until John was on the way, when she stopped working at Miss Parr's. She used to give a hand once a week to the Hopes, who were living here at the schoolhouse, and then the Bensons, when Mr. Benson took over. That's when she became school cleaner." Mr. Willett paused, blowing out his cheeks. "Still," he went on, rallying slightly, "I suppose she's done a good job, considerin' she done it all through the war, while Fred was away. We all reckoned it did poor Fred a power of good to get away from Maud during the war. He looked much fresher when he come back." "I haven't seen Mr. Pringle yet." "Nor likely to," responded Bob Willett. "After the war he got a job up at the Atomic, and he's still at it. Gets the Atomic bus soon after 7, and when he gets home he spends most of the time in that shed of his at the end of the garden." "What does he do there?" "Keeps out of her ladyship's way, I shouldn't wonder, but he makes things with matchsticks as well." "Matchsticks?" I exclaimed, my mind boggling. "Models and that. Fairacre Church he done once, and it was on show at the village fete. Then he does a piano, not a life-size, of course, and that was a real masterpiece, and a set of chairs for a doll's house. He's a clever chap in his way, although he don't say much. Come to think of it, I suppose he can't get a word in edgewise with his missus, so he's driven to matchsticks." He made for the door. "Best have another tidy up of the coke pile. Them little varmints can't leave it alone." And he departed, leaving me to mull over the story of Mrs. Pringle's love life. During these early days at Fairacre, I had a great deal to learn, not only about my new job, but also about the people of the village. Mrs. Pringle herself enlightened me on many aspects of life in the country. At that time, the village had no piped water, and rain barrels stood by the houses collecting rainwater from spouts. I soon learnt to appreciate this precious fluid, and Mrs. Pringle was my chief adviser. What she called the top quality, that is, the filtered water which supplied the schoolhouse, was used for drinking and cooking. The rainwater from barrels was used for bathing, hair washing, laundering, and other household activities, but still had other uses which Mrs. Pringle explained to me. "Soapy water from the washin' does the floors," she told me, "and then after that you can use some for pouring over the flagstones on the path and give them a good brushin' with a stiff broom. And what's left you throws over the cabbages and such like in the garden. There's no need," she continued, turning a fierce eye upon me, "to waste a drop." In times of drought, the villagers were hard-pressed, and Fairacre Pond furnished a few precious bucketfuls for cleaning operations. Mr. Roberts, the local farmer, had put in a bore to keep his cattle watered, and he let each household have a bucket or two of fresh water from his well for drinking when things became serious. Of necessity, we had earth closets, and thanks to Bob Willett and Mrs. Pringle, these were kept as hygienic as such primitive amenities could be. But it was a great relief to everyone when water was piped to the village some years after my arrival. Even so, the old ways persisted, and I noticed that Mrs. Pringle transferred what she termed lovely suds from the new wash basins to a pail in readiness to wash over the lobby floor. Considering the somewhat primitive hygiene which the Fairacre folk had perforce to endure, it was surprising to see what a healthy lot we all are. I suppose the air had something to do with it. Even on a still summer's day, there is a freshness in this downland air, and in the winter the winds can be ferocious, blowing away not only cobwebs, but any germs hovering about, I suspect. Dr. Martin, who looks after the local population, does not get called upon unnecessarily. Accidents on farms, unlucky tractor drivers pinned beneath overturned vehicles, men carelessly wielding scythes, hedge slashers, and other dangerous implements may get Dr. Martin's ready attention, but minor ailments are usually dealt with at home. Some of these remedies sound horrific, and over the years Mrs. Pringle has curdled my blood with her first aid tips. My young nephew, she once told me, had the whooping cough something dreadful, nearly coughed his heart up, and doctor's medicines never done him a bit of good. In the end, it was Bob Willett's old mother who suggested the fried mouse. Fried mouse? I quavered. Oh, it's a good old cure, is fried mouse. You want a fresh one, of course, and it's best to skin it and then try to eat it whole. I must have looked as horrified as I felt. Does sound unpleasant, don't it? Said Mrs. Pringle with evident satisfaction, but no end of people swear by it. Did it help your nephew? Well, no, it didn't. It didn't seem to work with him, but old Mrs. Willett's cure for chilblains was always a winner. And what was that? A thorough thrashing with sting and nettles. Worked a charm, always. Pondering on this after Mrs. Pringle had left to resume her duties, I could only suppose that the stings from the nettles acted as a counter-irritant to the itching of chilblains, but it all seemed unnecessarily violent to me, and I resolved to treat any chilblains I might suffer with more orthodox methods. But in my early days at the school, I soon discovered that apart from the inevitable childish complaints such as measles and chickenpox, my 30-odd pupils were a hardy lot, only succumbing occasionally to a bout of toothache or earache or an upset tummy, the latter usually in August or September when the apples and plums were unripe. The first aid box on the wall above the map cupboard was seldom used. A box of disinfectant, lint, and bandages for scraped knees and cut fingers were the things most often in demand, and as I pointed out, if the children kept off the coke pile, half the injuries would never have occurred at all. But I might have just as well saved my breath. It was Mrs. Pringle who first pointed out to me that it was traditional at Fairacre School to give a Christmas party to parents and friends. I thought as how it should be mentioned, she told me, so's you can decide if you want to go on with it. Alice Willett usually bakes a cake. Very nice it is, too, she added graciously. I said that I thought it was an excellent idea and would start planning straight away. Miss Clare confirmed Mrs. Pringle's information and was slightly amused at her early pronouncement. I meant to tell you in good time, she said, but Mrs. P. has got there first. I was careful to find out how things were traditionally done. One has to tread warily in a village, particularly if one is a newcomer. Mrs. Willett, it seemed, had the largest square baking tin in the village and was adept at producing enormous square cakes, ideal for cutting into neat fingers on festive occasions. Her coronation cake, Mrs. Pringle told me, was a real masterpiece, with the Union Jack piped on it in icing, and waving at that. It was Miss Clare who told me that it was right and proper for Mrs. Willett to be given the ingredients for such an expensive product, but this had to be done with great diplomacy, and the money was usually taken from the school funds. I negotiated these perils as well as I could, and rather dreaded meeting with Alice Willett to arrange about making the cake, but my fears were groundless. One misty November day, I called at her cottage after school to broach the subject, but she greeted me with a smile. The cake? Why, I made it nearly a month ago. It's not iced yet, of course, but the cake itself needs a few weeks to mature nicely. I always put a spoonful of brandy in it, but I don't tell Bob. He's a strict teetotaler, you see. I don't drink either, but I think a spot of brandy in a good fruit cake, a little drop of sherry and a trifle make all the difference. I began to make a halting speech about the cost of the cake, and Mrs. Willett opened a corner cupboard and took out a neat list which she handed me. It showed all the ingredients and the prices, and the total was shown clearly between two neatly ruled lines. It seemed extraordinarily modest to me. I studied the list again. "But you haven't put in eggs," I said, feeling rather proud of my perspicacity. Mrs. Willett looked shocked. "Oh, I wouldn't dream of charging for the eggs. They come from our own chickens, you see." "But all the more reason why you should charge for such a first-class product." No, I've never done it in all these years. Call it my contribution to Christmas, if you like." And with that I had to be content. The Christmas party took place during the last week of term. The schoolroom was garlanded with homemade paper chains, and a Christmas tree glittered in the corner. The children acted as hosts to their parents and friends of the school. The stoves roared merrily, and Mrs. Willett's Christmas cake was the centerpiece of the long tea table. In its center stood a snowman, some overlarge robins, and a tiny Christmas tree, and the children were loud in their admiration of Mrs. Willett's handiwork. Among our visitors was Amy, who was quite the most elegant figure among us, and also one of the most appreciative. At the end of the proceedings, when we had waved goodbye to the children and their guests, we turned back into the quiet schoolroom, crumbs and chaos about us, but also a blessed silence after the junketings. "Well," said Amy, "I don't know when I have enjoyed a party more. You certainly know how to do things in Fairacre." I was just beginning to glow with pride at these kind words when the door was flung open and Mrs. Pringle stood there surveying the scene. "Ha!" said the lady. "About time I made a start, I can see." Suddenly chilled, Amy and I made our escape to the schoolhouse. Chapter 5. Wartime Memories. As time passed, Mrs. Pringle and I established a precarious truce. Every now and again she would broach the question of cleaning my house, but I resisted her offers as civilly as I could. Mrs. Pringle during school hours was quite enough for me. I hoped that I could keep my home out of that lady's clutches. There were occasional clashes, of course, and after each one Mrs. Pringle's combustible leg would flare up and oblige her to drag the suffering limb about her duties with many a sigh and a wince. I grew very skilled at ignoring these manifestations of Mrs. Pringle's umbrage. The stoves were the usual source of trouble. For some reason, pencil sharpenings near these monsters, usually inside their fire guards, were a major source of irritation. The milk saucepan sometimes left a ring on the jet-black surface, and this too caused sharp comment. Wet footmarks, Coke crunched in, bubble gum, crumbs from lunch packets, and any other hazards to Mrs. Pringle's floors were also severely criticized, and, up to a point, she had my support. She was indeed a sore trial, but I reminded myself that she was a superb cleaner, and, as I was always being told, Fairacre School was a model of hygiene in the area. I also remembered Mr. Willett's advice. "You don't want to worry about her funny ways. She's always been a Tartar since a girl. All Fairacre knows that." It was some comfort in times of crisis. Mrs. Pringle's bossiness had been well to the fore during the war years, it seems. Fairacre, in company with most rural communities, had its fair share of evacuees, and Mrs. Pringle was lucky in that the couple billeted upon her were a middle-aged, self-effacing pair who inhabited one room of her semi-detached cottage and who were careful to creep into the kitchen when Mrs. Pringle had finished her labors there. Next door there lived a middle-aged lady, Jane Morgan, who was not as fortunate as Mrs. Pringle in her evacuees, Mrs. Jarman and her 4 boisterous children. They ruled the roost and soon clashed with Mrs. Pringle next door. At the time, Jane Morgan's husband and Fred Pringle were both away in the army. Mrs. Jarman's husband had been killed in the Blitz of May 1941, and it was then that the 3 solitary women, the 4 Jarman children, and Mrs. Pringle's schoolboy son John were fated to meet at close quarters. The Jarman family was an indomitable one. Despite the loss of a husband and father, not to mention their home and all that was in it, the Jarman's Cockney spirit remained irrepressible. The children took to taunting Mrs. Pringle over the hedge, and when that lady reported the matter to their mother, Mrs. Jarman joined in the battle with equal zest. For once, it seemed, Mrs. Pringle was on the losing side. One of their skirmishes took place in the village hall. During wartime, this building was in constant use for a great many village functions, and also as an extra classroom on weekdays to accommodate the London children evacuated to Fairacre. It was on the occasion of a local jumble sale that the clash between Mrs. Pringle and Mrs. Jarman was observed by some dozen or so Fairacre ladies who were sorting out the contributions ready for the Saturday afternoon sale. Mrs. Jarman and Mrs. Pringle had entered the hall together. Mrs. Pringle deposited a large bundle on the floor before making her way with ponderous dignity to her stall marked junk, and starting to arrange chipped vases, molting cushions, lidless saucepans, and innumerable objects of china or tarnished metal to which no one could give a name. Meanwhile, Mrs. Jarman had fallen to her knees beside the bundle dropped by her neighbor and was holding up threadbare underpants, cardigans washed so often that they resembled felt, and a number of men's shirts. She kept up a running commentary as she sorted out the garments. Some of the comments were ribald enough to shock a few of the Fairacre folk, but on the whole there was secret delight in seeing Mrs. Pringle discomfited. "Look at these!" shrieked Mrs. Jarman, scrabbling among the shirts. "Not a button between 'em. Who's pinched 'em, eh?" Mrs. Pringle's voice boomed from her corner. "I cut them off to use again, as would anyone in wartime. There's such a thing as thrift, which a lot of folk not 100 miles from here don't ever seem to have heard of." This lofty speech did nothing to curb Mrs. Jarman's spirit. "How mean can you get?" she yelled back. "Nothing mean about it," returned Mrs. Pringle, putting a headless garden gnome to best advantage on the stall. "I simply collect shirt buttons. They're bound to be needed." "I'll remember that," cried Mrs. Jarman, unearthing a moth-eaten strip of fur. "I wonder what sort of skin disease this ratty old collar would give you." Now that's enough, said Mrs. Partridge, the vicar's wife, who had just arrived. "Time's getting short, and we must get on." Even Mrs. Jarman took some notice of Mrs. Partridge and curbed her tongue. Work continued apace with considerably more decorum, and all the stalls were ready by 12:30. The helpers returned to their homes to dish up spam, whale meat, a piece of unidentifiable fish, or some other wartime delicacy, before returning to the fray at 2:30. The open warfare between Mrs. Jarman and Mrs. Pringle was a source of much pleasure to all who witnessed it, and each skirmish was noted with interest. It was generally felt that the Battle of the Buttons would have some repercussions, probably on that same day, but there was no sign of anything other than disdain on Mrs. Pringle's side and raucous laughter on Mrs. Jarman's. Both ladies, in any case, were kept busy with the throng of customers snapping up old shoes, stained waistcoats, and cracked crockery throughout the afternoon. Those who'd witnessed the earlier exchange were slightly disappointed. Over the months, the shirt button incident was forgotten, and it was not until after Christmas that the sequel to the quarrel became general knowledge in Fairacre. One of the uses to which the village hall's large copper was put during wartime was the communal boiling of the village's Christmas puddings. Each basin was clearly labeled with its owner's name, and all were lodged securely in the capacious boiler. Naturally, the water had to be topped up at intervals, and a list of ladies was pinned up on the wall. The afternoon session was designated thus: 2:30, Mrs. Pringle; 3:30, Miss Parr, only that would really be her maid carrying out her elderly mistress's orders; 4:30, Mrs. Jarman; 5:30, everyone welcome. This was when the puddings would be claimed by their owners, the boiler turned off, and the village hall locked for the night. The precious puddings, of course, were then carefully stored away in Fairacre larders to await Christmas Day. It was innocent little Mrs. Morgan, unwilling hostess to the Jarman family, who spread the news of Mrs. Pringle's remarkable Christmas pudding about the village of Fairacre. It so happened that Mrs. Pringle had invited her sister and niece to share the Christmas festivities with her son John and herself. Corporal Fred Pringle was on military duty, and so was Jane Morgan's husband. The Jarmans had invited a horde of relatives and friends to spend the day with them, and Mrs. Pringle, prompted more by malice against the Jarmans rather than neighborliness to Jane Morgan, hastened to invite that lady to share their Christmas dinner. As Jane and Mrs. Pringle's sister were old friends, the invitation was gratefully accepted. The roast duck was delicious, the vegetables beautifully cooked, and everyone was most complimentary. The Christmas pudding, steamed and aromatic, awaited Mrs. Pringle's knife. It was apparent, as soon as the first slice was removed, that a number of foreign bodies mingled with the glutinous mixture. "Threepenny bits!" shouted John. "Sixpences!" squeaked his cousin excitedly. Mrs. Pringle's bewilderment was apparent. "I don't hold with metal objects in pudding," she said austerely, passing plates. "Quite right," agreed Jane. "My mother always said the same, but she did put little china dolls in when we were small. We used to wash them afterwards and put them in the doll's house." But no one was listening to her reminiscences. Forks and spoons were busy pushing the pudding this way and that, and on the rim of each plate a pile of assorted shirt buttons grew larger. "Someone," said Mrs. Pringle, with a face like thunder, "has been playing tricks on us, and I know just who it is." At that moment, a particularly loud yell of half-tipsy laughter could be heard through the wall. Mrs. Pringle rose majestically and went to open the last precious tin of pineapple chunks to augment the despoiled Christmas pudding. Boxing Day had hardly passed before the sequel to the Battle of the Buttons was known to all Fairacre, but Mrs. Jarman denied any knowledge of it. And we'll hear more wartime memories centering on Mrs. Pringle next time.